panel session. And if I can ask Karen Pierce to bring her team up, please, to the front. So we're very pleased to have Karen Pierce, the permanent representative to the WTO and the UN in Geneva, someone who's only been in her post for 1 month, but I see that she was previously a director responsible for Afghanistan, so she's no doubt finding it a simple task. Joe Johnson, Julie Nutter, Harsha Singh and Leon Brittan, thank you very much, each and all of you.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to everybody for being here. We're going to aim to take the debate forward on the future of trade. We've got about 45 minutes for that. I too have taken my watch off. I think as well it's worth bearing in mind the longer term, as David Liddington was alluding to. What sort of world trading system do we want in 20 years' time? It's served us very well up till now. Can we keep it that way? Of course, the Commission negotiate for the European Union and the UK in Geneva, but I might just pick out a couple of trends that are doing the Geneva rounds. The first is that negotiators recognise that the Doha development round is deadlocked, but it would be a mistake, I think, to declare it dead. As Pascal Lamy says, when you wake up in the morning, many of the issues will still be there, and we have to find a way through that. I think the other trend that people are noticing is a growing amount of protectionism around the world, and the G20 are among some of the worst offenders in not removing protectionist measures and in finding new ones. So that's something we very much hope Los Cabos will be able to address. There are two rays of light, I think. One concerns growing interest in trade facilitation, clearing the way through customs and other of those technical barriers. Trade facilitation potentially could put some 67 billion into world GDP. It's very much a win-win situation, but it's not always seen like that in Geneva. So finding the way through could be quite an important spur to the world economy in the next year. And then the other ray of light to point to, I think, is the services plurilateral. And plurilateral is, if you like, negotiations among consenting countries, a correlation of the willing rather than the universal multilateral setup. And the EU and US and other OECD countries are very interested in that. And the aim is to start with those countries and then create a system that developing countries could join later. But I think it's also worth Europe and the US bearing in mind that they don't want to miss the point here. The world trade system is changing, and Europe and the US, as the largest defenders of a liberal trading system, need to ensure that they preserve that and that they're on the same side. There's also growing recognition on trade finance, recognition of the importance of trade finance to stimulating trade, growth and development. And Geneva negotiators, finally, are watching with a lot of interest the moves on bilateral measures, on plurilateral negotiations. And I'd say, I think, if Harsha will forgive me, he knows the mood better than me, but I would say it's qualified. There's some qualified concern there about what this will mean for the multilateral system that has been built up over the years. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to turn to our panel. I'm going to start with Lord Brittan, if I may, then Julie, then Joe, and finally with Harsha, who's there on the ground in Geneva. We have about 5 minutes for each of the panelists, and then we'll take questions and answers from the audience. Thank you very much. Lord Brittan.
The first point that I would make is that if I compare the situation with when I was in the Commission negotiating the conclusion of the Uruguay round, which had been stalled for some time, but which we did bring to a successful conclusion. The main difference today is that the leading countries are not pressing for liberalisation of trade in the way that they were then. Now, at that time also, the world was in economic difficulties, not perhaps quite as severe as the ones that we have now, but nonetheless the economic situation was pretty gloomy. And people felt that there weren't many things that you could do. The idea of Keynesian boosts was not quite as fashionable as it has become in practice, if not in theory, since then. But the one thing that could be done was to liberalise trade. And that's one of the reasons why we were able to proceed further. But it's quite clear that the degree of liberalisation that took place in the Uruguay round, which was welcome. Nobody afterwards regretted it and said that this was all a mistake and we were going in the wrong direction. Left a very long way still to go, particularly in the area of services. So I was appointed by David Cameron to take time off from my normal job with UBS for 6 months and to see whether British trade policy had got it right, whether we had the right instruments, and among all things to see whether we could push for the Doha round to come to some kind of successful conclusion. And so naturally I saw all the main proponents, the main countries concerned, to ask them. And what I said was, now you've put a little bit on the table in terms of liberalisation offers. It's pretty small. Would you be able to go substantially further forward if this was really reaching the end game and if we were actually going to get a serious negotiation to bring a serious new round? And the answer, and I saw them privately and individually, in every single case was yes, we have a lot more that we could give, but it's entirely dependent on the United States being able to be much more active and proactive in this. And the truth of the matter is that as far as the United States was concerned, the United States was not opposed to this. The United States didn't say we haven't got the scope or the opportunity to liberalise further or to put more down on the table. But the trouble was that the United States didn't give trade liberalisation the priority that it got during the Clinton administration, and hasn't given it its priority, and isn't giving it the push that it got then. And I think that it's not quite as surprising as it sounds, because in fact it was very unusual for Clinton, for a Democratic administration, to be pushing for trade liberalisation. It wasn't in the genes, and in a sense, if you like, the Obama administration has reverted to type, not being against it, but not leading the push for it. So the question then is, what can we in the United Kingdom do in that kind of world situation? Well, we can certainly advance our own trade, and one of the things that I did do when acting as trade advisor to David Cameron was to push him, not that he needed any pushing at all, but to extend the activities of the Export Credit Guarantee Department to stimulate and help British trade. And that, I think, was a useful thing to do, but a small thing to do. The question that we're asked, though, also is there scope for substantial liberalisation, and does it matter to the United Kingdom? Well, I would unhesitatingly answer, the answer is yes, because the liberalisation that has taken place has been largely in the area of trade in goods, and it is exactly in the area of services, where the liberalisation is still embryonic, that Britain stands most to gain. We are a service economy more than anything else, even though it be a mistake to write off industry as being old hat in the way that has sometimes been done. But the difficulty as far as liberalisation of services is concerned has not often been clearly identified, but it became absolutely clear to me what the difficulty was. The difficulty is that it involves more than regulatory cooperation. It involves, in the area of services, mutual recognition to a very great extent of the process of regulation in the different countries. And that has been something where the regulatory agencies, whether in the United States or in Europe, have been extremely reluctant to agree to. It's been a tough issue that they are happy with this in principle, but they don't actually certainly want to hand over regulation to anyone else, but they're not even prepared to recognize other people's regulation, still less to apply regulatory standards of other countries themselves, which is another technique that could be used. A great reluctance on that part, and that continues to be the case. As far as the G20 is concerned, which we are asked to address as a possible alternative focus, frankly, I think in the area of trade, the idea that the G20 is the new saviour is quite mistaken. It hasn't worked, and they are maybe talking the talk, but they're not doing the actual stuff. But on the other hand, there are rays of hope. Although, of course, it is possible to identify growing protectionism, as the chairman has done, nonetheless, I think when you consider the degree of problems in the world economy and the stage at which we're at, I think that the degree of protectionism that has crept in is much, much less than one might have expected. The message that protectionism doesn't actually solve anything has entered the genes, if you like, of world leaders, and the resort to protectionism, which you might have expected in current circumstances, has been much less. And we've seen, again, trade facilitation, as has been mentioned by the chair preceding. And finally, the last point that I want to make relates to the point that was made by the chairman about plurilateralism. And here I think that the world trading community has moved on from the situation which we were in 20 years ago, where plurilateralism was regarded as a sort of heresy. You had to recognize that it took place, that there were sometimes agreements which were not multilateral in the sense that everybody participated in it, but it was almost a sin against the Holy Ghost, and you had to grudgingly accept that some people resorted to that because they couldn't get you couldn't get universal agreement. That has changed, whether per force or because of persuasion, I don't know, but it's now seen that actually the liberalization of trade between consenting adults, as it were, is a beneficial thing, even if it's not universal, because if it works, first of all, it reduces barriers and therefore increases trade and prosperity, but secondly, if it works, it'll be catching and other people will do the same thing. So there's been a kind of ideological shift in the world trade community, which I personally welcome. So the picture is greyish and murky. It's not wonderful. It has changed, but some of the change has been positive. Thank you.
Lord Brittan, thank you very much. Can I turn now to Julie Natter?
I would like to start with my remarks with talking about services, talk a little bit about the plurilateral and our perspective on it, talk very briefly about the US-EU high-level working group, and then talk about the Transatlantic Economic Council. It ties into a lot of things that have been said already. Services are extremely important to the U.S. economy. 8 out of 10 new jobs in the U.S. is related to services. 3/4 of our GDP is tied to services. So this is an area that's of fundamental importance to our economy. I'm glad to hear that I'm not a sinner anymore. I'll talk a little bit about our perspective on the plurilateral and services. We are now dealing with a group in the WTO of like-minded countries who want to go forward to try to liberalize trade in services. This includes 19 WTO members, including the EU. We're receiving inquiries from other members also on going forward with it. The basic concept is to create a new multi-party services agreement that would harmonize treatment across FTAs, for example. Because frequently FTAs have high standards, we would like to harmonize the treatment across FTAs and create a platform to work on issues affecting services, particularly new ones like cross-border data flows, which is extremely important to the financial services industry. Right now, the group appears to be reaching a consensus on a high level of ambition, and some of the particulars of that are that the scope should encompass all sectors and modes. Market access commitments should correspond closely with actual practice. New market access must be on the table. And new and enhanced rules will also be subject to negotiation. Right now, we are moving into the next phase where we need to determine the mechanics of how we go forward and make these determinations a reality. We believe that the initiative will produce both short and long-term benefits. There are economic benefits and also systemic benefits to the international trading system if an agreement is to be successful. Moving on to the US-EU high-level working group, and I will be very brief on this. We have consistently said that we want to be ambitious, but we want a feasible agreement. And to us, that means we need to have an agreement that we will be able to sell to our Congress. That's nothing new. The Congress plays a very, very important role in trade negotiations in the US because ultimately the Congress has to say okay. With this, we have an interim report on what our experts have come up with, areas of negotiation that we could go forward on, that will be put out at the end of June. I just got an email this morning that says the report will be published. We hope that the report will be ambitious for everyone's tastes, as ambitious as we can for everyone's taste. Our business community is very, very interested in these negotiations. I have heard some speculation that our business community is not, which surprises me a little bit. Because when you take the components of a possible negotiation, which are tariffs, non-tariff barriers, services, investment, and one more, regulatory issues, our businesses are extremely interested in all of them, but surprisingly in a couple that you wouldn't normally think about. For example, tariffs. If we went to zero tariffs, our companies would benefit greatly in terms of reduced costs because 40% of US-EU trade is actually intra-company trade. And sometimes in the production process, goods are taxed 2 and 3 times when they pay tariffs when they go across the ocean in some stages of processing. So this is very important to us. Services, of course, are very important to our companies because of their importance to our GDP. And regulatory issues are extremely important also. I have heard members of our business community wish that the high-level working group would create some sort of mechanism that takes the regulatory work on after the perceived 18 to 24-month period where we would be negotiating. That this would be a living part of the agreement that would actually live on after the agreement is done. But when we talk about the high-level working group, often the rays of light that Lord Brittan has talked about, sometimes these rays of light, which are modest, are overshadowed by the big political movements. And some of the rays of light are coming from the Transatlantic Economic Council, which was created in 2007, and as I can attest from personal experience, was hung up for a couple of years on chicken. The group was actually created more to go forward with regulatory cooperation with the EU. And after the chicken wars, or a reprise of the chicken wars actually, it was decided that the TEC would look forward to new issues coming up where we could cooperate with the EU before regulations are written on either side of the Atlantic. It's a very good idea. And I just wanted to end by pointing out some of the modest but significant accomplishments in the last 6 months of the TEC. One is the US and the EU have been trying to revitalize the UN World Forum for Harmonization on Electric Vehicles. This, has a lot of importance on either side of the Atlantic because electric vehicles are a green, good way to go forward on transportation in the future. The UN body develops global regulations, and at the March 2012 meeting, China requested to serve as co-vice chairman with Japan of 2 informal groups covering e-vehicle safety and environmental issues. This is a very good example of bringing in third countries into what we're doing in the regulatory space. We launched US-EU investment principles on April 10th. We signed a mutual recognition decision on secure trade on May 4th. We signed an MOU on toy safety, which means that our regulations on toy safety will not have unnecessary divergences. We declared mutual recognition on air cargo security regimes as of June 1st, an extremely important trade facilitation issue for business. And we will have discussions, we had discussions the beginning of May on e-health, another one of these new innovative sectors that we will cooperate on. So I just wanted to end on an optimistic note because, as Lord Brittan did, because it's easy to be gloomy in the international trade arena.
Julie, thank you very much indeed for that. Can we turn now to Joe Johnson? Joe.
Great, thanks Karen. I've been asked to give a perspective on trade challenges facing the UK from the perspective of an amateur enthusiast on the backbenches in Westminster. I think, put it in context, when David Cameron made his first speech on the British economy after becoming Prime Minister in May 2010, he identified Britain as suffering from 2 twin deficits, 1, the trade deficit, and 2, a structural budget deficit. On the second of those, the coalition government in the first 2 years has made clear and steady progress. The deficit has been reduced by 25% from 11.1% in March 2010 to 8.3% in March 2012. The Independent Office of Budget Responsibility forecasts that the deficit will come down to 2.9% by March 2015. So at least on one of those fronts, Britain is making steady progress. The backdrop to the trade deficit was in some ways even more challenging in some respects. Trade deficit, among other things, reflects a structural lack of competitiveness, and the UK has run a trade deficit every year since 1984, and in all but 6 years since 1900. Generating export competitiveness is obviously a massive and complex project, and you can't wish it overnight. And it's complicated by the fact that in the UK, many firms are still facing very much the wrong way, facing towards developed, low-growth markets, and have not reoriented themselves as rapidly as those of comparable mid-sized European economies to faster-growing parts of the world. The UK, for example, we export only 6.5% of our exports are to the BRICS. Germany, the proportion is closer to 12%, while in Japan, the proportion is 4 times ours. As I said, the EU remains overwhelmingly our biggest market, 45% of our exports, and our trading relationships, which have been shaped over centuries by cultural, linguistic, and historical ties, won't budge rapidly. Reorienting our trade patterns will take, sadly, longer than a political cycle. That said, the government has set about this task with gusto, as appointing Lord Brittan to his role as trade advisor, appointing Lord Green to chair a new cabinet subcommittee on trade for the first time, really renewing the UK's commercial diplomacy in a manner which was welcomed by the Foreign Office, 50 new posts in China, 30 new posts in India, and basically doing whatever the government can do in terms of overhauling UKTI, overhauling, as Lord Brittan says, the ECGD, to make it easier for new firms to rise to the challenge of exporting. I think it's absolutely critical, given what is already a very difficult trading background in our core markets, that markets actually remain open. And Karen, in her opening remarks, mentioned that there were growing signs of protectionism. And I think one of the positive factors in over the last few years during the financial crisis is how little sign there has been of a return to 1930s style outright trade wars. We've had bits and pieces of protectionism, but no actual return to a trade war. And I think it's critical that the EU, in the turmoil that it's going through at the moment, doesn't inadvertently destabilize what has been one of the great successes of global trade over the past few years, namely the success of the single market. As David Lidington said in his remarks, Britain has over the decades been one of the most consistent and vocal champions of the single market. He mentioned Lord Cockfield, the author of the 1985 white paper that gave birth to the single market. Lord Brittan played an important role as a competition commissioner in consolidating that achievement. But we cannot be complacent about the single market and about its continuing contribution to economic growth in the EU. The politics really don't look good at the moment. If you think about it, we've got youth unemployment in periphery countries approaching 50% or exceeding 50%. That could easily turn into a trigger for protectionism in a climate in which the single market is taken as a proxy for globalization, for the difficulties facing low-skilled young workers in an era of globalization. So I think the single market can potentially be vulnerable in a climate in which youth unemployment is rising inexorably, it seems. Simultaneously, we're also in a period where there is reduced confidence in laissez-faire as a general theory, and that's left policymakers more vulnerable than ever to the siren of economic nationalism. Jacques Delors' famous lament that no one ever fell in love with the single market has seldom been more true. And picking up on a point that David Lidington made in his remarks, I think there is a further threat to the single market from the possibility, from the potential that closer economic and fiscal cooperation among the 25 countries that are signatories to the fiscal compact and potentially further signatories to a banking union, that closer fiscal coordination creates a gravitational pull of decision-making within the EU towards an inner core, and Britain must ensure, as David Lidington said, that the single market remains properly the preserve of the 27 member states, not just the 25 or however many end up being a part of a fiscal compact and banking union. Failure to do so, failure to ensure that the single market remains the preserve of the 27, would be, in my view, to run the risk that the center of gravity within the EU would shift towards a more Franco-centric view of the world with a greater tendency to protectionism and interventionism, a development that could potentially undermine the single market if it were to mean a return to picking winners and supporting national champions, with the single market distorted by a combination of any of state aids, government subsidies, concessional credits, privileged access to public tenders, or trade protections targeted at particular firms or industries. I won't go on too long about the need to complete the single market. That's motherhood and apple pie. Everybody knows that in an era where there's little room, little fiscal space for fiscal stimulus, the single market is really one of our only options to generate growth and jobs. It's estimated that it could add up to 4,200 euros for each European household in additional GDP. In the UK alone, the Department of Business estimates that completing the single market could increase our trade with other EU countries by 45% and increase individual household income by 7%. Of course, as David and Mark Hoban also mentioned in their remarks, completing the single market is one thing. We've got to keep Europe open. the single market working, but we've also got to keep on ensuring that Europe remains open to the world. As other panelists have already mentioned, Doha, is stalled, but it's not necessarily dead. Whilst we hope to revive it, we've got to move forward with putting in place other trade agreements that facilitate market access for our firms in fast-growing parts of the world. The EU's just signed an FTA with South Korea. There are hopes to have similar agreements in place with Singapore, India, and Canada, I believe, by the end of the year. And all of those deals currently on the table could potentially, according to estimates, add a further 90 billion euros to Europe's GDP. So in conclusion, Britain's got a role to play in keeping the single market going, in helping Europe reform, undertake the structural reforms that will keep it moving along, and also simultaneously to keep Europe open to the world. Thank you.
Joe, thank you very much indeed. Can I now turn to Harsha Singh, who's our final panelist, and then we'll take questions. Harsha.
Thank you very much. It's both a pleasure and a privilege to be here and learn from the experts. A number of points which I'm going to touch upon have been made. That the international nature of financial instruments, we should avoid disproportionate regulation, should not be over-prescriptive, concerns about extraterritoriality, home bias, fragmentation. And also it was pointed out that the degree of protectionism is less than is expected. We at the WTO worked hard to prepare a monitoring report, which was then used by the member countries, and that actually contributed a lot, the peer review and reliable data to see what each country was doing. In the context of financial services, and my 3 points relate directly to financial services, so I won't be going to goods sector. But in a world of supply chain, in a world with trade in tasks, where goods and services work together as a package to bring about transactions, actually we need to look at the larger scope of trade rather than just the services or financial services in order to see what are the conditions for health of this sector. Because financial services figure in all these transactions. So if it's correct that protectionism is less than was expected, but it's creeping up. And it's like cholesterol, as the WTO Director General said recently. It keeps clogging up the arteries, and those actions which have been taken earlier are still there, most of them. So we need to make sure that this is given emphasis in terms of reversing the trend and keeping markets open. This is especially so because growth in volume of trade this year is expected to be just about 3.7%, way below the annual average for the past 20 years. With regard to financial services, studies have shown that levels of applied regulatory barriers are high in this sector, something which Lord Brittan also referred to. And in this context, what role would WTO have to play in new forms of trade agreements is the first point, e.g. plurilateral non-single undertaking. Plurilateral we've heard quite a lot on in terms of the International Services Agreement, plurilateral in the context of WTO members. Non-single undertaking can be looked at in two different ways, in my opinion. One is that it relates to only services or only financial services, or it is an agreement which is non-MFN, which means that you don't have whatever opening of market is there is not available to all members. So it's a limited one, like a free trade area agreement. The role of WTO actually can be in terms of providing a framework of disciplines, and the existing agreements and initiatives can be seen as models, and I'll just very quickly explain this. First, of course, ideal is a multilateral agreement in the WTO, and that's something which those who are going for this international services agreement have not found it feasible to the extent of the ambition which they have, so they are going towards an agreement which is not multilateral. You can have a multilateral agreement not necessarily covering all sectors, but just a single sector also. Examples are information technology agreement, financial services, and basic telecom agreements themselves, which took place at the end of the Uruguay round. You can have agreements on policy issues of significant importance, like government procurement, regulatory transparency, regulatory cooperation. I think a lot of the conflicts which we have talked about, several of them could be addressed through regulatory cooperation also, reducing the risk available. The WTO agreements provide a model for having a similar domestic regulatory discipline across different countries, where an example is the reference paper in basic telecom. And when you combine this with regulatory cooperation, I think you have a framework for something more sustainable and less conflicting than the kind of situation which we heard from the speakers today in the morning. And that could be also done in terms of the application of the Basel III requirements and taking them forward through reform. The bilateral or regional agreements or free trade agreements are actually provided for in the WTO framework. It's not outside the WTO framework. You just have to meet certain specified conditions which try and maintain a level playing field for all. And one of them is something which Julie mentioned, that the scope must encompass all modes and sectors. So to that extent, the plurilateral which she talked about is within the scope of the WTO framework. There we have seen an advance over the WTO per se, but still the WTO agreements provide a benchmark. And why do they do so? Because some of them cover the same areas as in the WTO agreements, but go beyond what is there in the WTO. It's very interesting, and that the applied policies in virtually all countries are far more liberal and by a huge margin compared to the binding levels. It's the more single undertaking, it's more of what is the trade-off in different modes, like a natural person going and delivering services in another market vis-a-vis establishment of foreign capital in another market. These kind of trade-offs which have stopped progress on that. But the scope is there, and that's again something which this plurilateral agreement is looking at. Another one is additional to WTO, which is those areas which are not within the WTO framework. That, of course, is very much part of what the new framework of plurilateral or FTA, etc., is looking at. And it's not just in the context of the International Services Agreement, but also other FTAs like the TPP, etc. You can have positive list, negative list approaches. Both have been discussed in the WTO. And even within the new initiatives, there are issues of regulatory cooperation, which may be for areas like emerging technologies, mutually recognizing authorized economic operators, the kind of things which EU, US are trying to do, plus the electronic data, etc., which you talked about. So these are the various ways in which the WTO framework can actually work to point the way. Of course, the ideal, as I said, is a multilateral agreement. And that's something which needs to be continued to be looked at, and hopefully we should be able to be in a position sometime to succeed with that. The next one is, what impact will new capital requirements for trade finance contained in Basel III have on global trade? It's worth noting that, and this is in the context of the points made about disproportionate regulation, prescriptiveness of regulation, etc., that when we are looking at the kind of conditions of Basel III and relating it to trade finance per se, the starting point showed very clearly that it was not recognized that trade finance is an area with much less risk than that encompassed in the Basel conditions. It actually has much less risk for a number of reasons, which is because the shorter time period, they are self-liquidating, etc., and have a major impact on development. Basel III, the committee the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has actually changed some of the conditions, like the one-year maturity floor and the stipulation about the sovereign risk to be applied to these smaller financial transactions. But we still have some conditions in Basel III there. Basel III and the committee has asked the ICC to continue to get more data. WTO is one of the agencies they are discussing with, and we are pressing them to keep on treating this area as one with much less risk and therefore be treated differently. On the risk of fragmentation of global capital market regulation, what we need to keep in mind is that though we have some important objectives of limiting risk, at the same time we need to ensure that the global market which we have created, and it's not just the European market, but it's the world market which is growing today. And if you have home bias, if you have extraterritoriality, you impose several costs. You limit the markets, you basically prevent people from operating in different markets. And an important point which is often lost is that we don't live in a one-period game. If any country is taking any policy measure today, and it has an impact or perceived impact on another country, there will be pressure in that country to follow suit. And as in a letter, a Canadian financial sector senior official commenting on the US draft regulation on the Volcker rule said, if other jurisdictions enacted legislation with a similar home bias to the draft US rule, the result would be a fragmentation of global capital markets, reducing liquidity, financial stability, and economic efficiency. I feel that we need to take account of the kind of principles I started with, where we look multilaterally, we try and see how we can actually mitigate some of our concerns through regulatory cooperation, through transparency, through fora which allow for discussions, fora which are available in many places, including the WTO. And with sensitivity, if we are able to go forward, then I think we should be able to at least come out of the difficult conditions earlier and create the condition also for the growing markets to join with greater confidence. The European Parliament has adopted for trade finance a more liberal approach. That's a good start. It's a good point which I heard that China was part of the Committee on Regulatory Issues. And in this context, I think, as I started with, the model of WTO gives you a very good indication of the kind of things you can go ahead with. Thank you.
Harsha, thank you very much indeed for that. We do have time for a couple of questions. Could I ask you to keep them to questions, please, so that the panel have time to interact with you? Would anyone like to kick off? Yes, please. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. Tony Gillan from the Institute of Ideas. A cheeky question for Lord Brittan and Joe Johnson, if I may, which is the political attitude towards our airport capacity problem symbolic of our attitudes towards future trade? If we're going to trade in the future, do we not need more political conviction to make our country more competitive, to make it a reality?
Thank you. Lord Brittan, then Joe Johnson.
Well, I can speak freely as I have no involvement of any kind in this thing. I think that what we're seeing is not some fundamental ideological decision, but the effect of particular political forces of an extremely strong kind. And there's no doubt at all that the objection to further runways in the existing airports reflects public opinion in the areas concerned, is very strongly felt, and has impacted government policy. That, in principle, it would be in the interests of growth and trade to have such runways. There's no question at all that is so, but the political balance is in a different direction, and one else has to face that fact as reflected in what parties have said before the election. Now, over the long term, if you want my personal view, I think the right answer is a completely new estuarial airport. That, of course, would be both extremely expensive and take a long time. But that is the only real answer to resolving the irreconcilable conflict of values and interests which otherwise would not be capable of being resolved.
Thank you. Joe?
Well, I agree with everything Lord Brittan said, and I'm also a very strong supporter of an estuary airport, as you might expect. I have an airport in my own constituency, Biggin Hill Airport, and I know from the residents who live around it how little they want it to turn into a commercial airport. At present, it's used by hobbyists and business jets. Many of you probably fly in there in your Falcons, but at the moment it's just used by sort of light aircraft, and residents in Orpington certainly don't want it under pressure of lack of capacity elsewhere to turn into a new city or a new Luton. We desperately need new capacity in London and the southeast. The estuary is the most logical place for it, and frankly, we've got to do it now.
Apologies, it was meant to be a symbolic question rather than asking you to comment on the airport policy. It was about political conviction to make the transformations necessary within the UK at all levels of competitiveness in terms of restructuring our economy and doing some painful decision-taking that is unpopular in order to make us competitive, in order to trade in the way in which, Joe, you were talking about with other parts of the world.
Well, I understand the point you're trying to make. I do think the government is very committed to ensuring British businesses engage rapidly with fast-growing parts of the world, and obviously connectivity is a part of that. Visas is a part of that. And there are people who are putting as much pressure on the government on these matters as they can. That's all I can say, really.
Thank you. Yes, please. Gentleman over there.
John Nash from Willis. Could I just ask Joe Johnson the question? You talked about the trade surplus of this country for six years out of the past, since 1900, I think. What is the position if we look at the current balance, if we factor in the invisible earnings as well? Because this country is much more service orientated than money.
No, I was giving you the current account figures there. Yeah.
Any more quick questions? In which case, I'll thank our panel very much for their insightful contributions and to you for listening so attentively. The picture could be worse, I think is what we heard, but there's some important rays of light, leaving the chickens to one side, and those rays of light concern the importance of the EU and the US working together, the importance of tackling the regulatory framework. So thank you very much to the panel.